Okay, hello and welcome back to the deep dive. Today, we're peeling back the layers on something truly fundamental to the modern world, something you interact with basically every single day. The English language.
That's right. And it's incredible just how widespread it is today. I
Mhm.
mean, think about it. Native language in the UK, the US, Canada, Australia, New Zealand, Ireland.
Right, and loads of Caribbean nations too, like Barbados, Jamaica, Guyana. The list goes on.
And that's just native speakers. Its official status is even broader, something like 54 sovereign countries, plus another 27 non-sovereign places.
Wow. So trying to actually count speakers gets tricky, doesn't it?
It really does. Are you counting native speakers, people using it as a second language, maybe for government or education in their own country?
Or people learning it as a foreign language.
Exactly. The numbers vary quite a bit depending on how you define it. But some estimates from maybe the mid-2000s gave figures like around 400 million native speakers,
Yeah.
maybe a similar number, 400 million, using it as a second language.
Right.
And then this huge group, maybe 600, 700 million, learning or using it as a foreign language.
That scale is just immense, especially when you contrast it with, say, Shakespeare's time.
Oh, absolutely.
Yeah.
Back then, estimates are, what, maybe 5 to 7 million speakers total?
Tiny, comparatively.
It really is.
Yeah.
And even just between the early 1600s and the mid-1900s, it jumped 50-fold, up to 250 million.
Yeah.
That explosion is, well, it's staggering.
It really frames how much this language has moved and expanded. But English didn't just appear out of nowhere, did it? It has roots, a family tree.
Precisely. It belongs to the biggest language family we know of, the Indo-European family.
Okay.
And within that huge family, you find the Germanic branch. That's where English sits.
And that Germanic branch itself splits further.
It does. You've got East Germanic that included Gothic, but those languages are extinct now.
Ah, right.
Then North Germanic, which gave rise to Danish, Swedish, Norwegian, Icelandic, the Scandinavian languages, basically.
Okay.
And then there's West Germanic.
And that's our branch?
That's where English fits in, alongside modern, German, Dutch, Flemish, Frisian.
So, linguistically speaking, English and German are fairly close cousins then, within that West Germanic group.
Relatively speaking, yes, though they've obviously taken very different paths. English has borrowed words like crazy throughout its history,
Mm-hmm.
much more so than German, which has been, you could say, a bit more conservative linguistically.
Interesting. Okay, so we have this global language, English, with its roots deep in the Indo-European family, specifically the West Germanic branch. But for this deep dive, we want to go back even further, right? Before English even landed in Britain.
Exactly. What was the linguistic situation before English arrived? Who was actually living there and what were they speaking? That's the real question for today.
So where do we start? Who are the earliest folks we know about on the island?
Well, pinpointing the absolute first people is always tough for historians. But the earliest inhabitants discussed in our sources, the ones with a significant historical footprint, are the Celts.
The Celts, okay. And when did they arrive in Britain?
The evidence suggests they started migrating over from mainland Europe, places like the Lower Rhine, the same basin area, maybe around 600 BCE.
600 BCE. So they were established in Britain for, what, over 1,000 years before the groups that brought early English even showed up?
That's the timeline, yeah, over a millennium. And they weren't just in Britain. Celtic peoples were spread across large parts of Europe during the Iron Age.
Right. I've heard them mentioned alongside Germanic and Slavic peoples as groups the Romans called barbarians.
That was the Roman perspective, yes.
Yeah.
Anyone outside the Greco-Roman world often got lumped into that category. And you can trace their descendants today in populations like the Scots, the Irish, the Welsh, Manx, Cornish, and even the Bretons over in France.
So what were these ancient Celts like? What do we know about their culture?
Well, the historical and archaeological picture shows they were really skilled metalworkers. Iron, gold. Some even think the name Celt might be linked to a type of tool, like a chisel or axe head, called a celt or celt.
Ah, interesting connection.
Yeah. They're also known as warriors, artists, definitely traders, miners, builders. Quite a dynamic society.
And language-wise. They spoke Celtic languages, obviously.
Yeah.
And their religion was Druidism.
That's right. Druidism was their spiritual tradition. And much later, those famous legends of Merlin and King Arthur, they draw heavily on that deep well of Celtic mythology.
Ah, okay. What about descriptions of them?
Classical writers, like the Romans and Greeks, often describe them physically as being tall, fair-skinned, often with fair hair and blue eyes. This contrasted with the Mediterranean peoples they were more used to.
And there was something about their social structure, too. Maybe more equality than we assume for ancient times.
Yes, that's a fascinating point raised in some historical interpretations. There's evidence suggesting that Celtic societies might have allowed for more, let's say, gender equality than many others at the time. Women could apparently be rulers, queens, even religious leaders.
That really does challenge the simple barbarian label, doesn't it?
It absolutely does. It paints a much more nuanced picture. Okay, so after this long period of Celtic dominance, the next major power shift was the arrival of the Romans.
Right, the Roman conquest. That started in 43 CE.
Correct. Britain, or Britannia as they called it, became a Roman province.
And they stuck around for quite a while.
They did, almost 400 years. Their rule lasted until about 410 CE.
Why did they leave then?
It wasn't really a voluntary withdrawal. The Roman Empire itself was facing huge problems, internal conflicts, pressure on its borders elsewhere in Europe. They essentially had to pull their legions back from Britain to deal with threats closer to home.
Okay, so 4 centuries of Roman rule. What did that mean for the languages spoken in Britain? Did Latin take over?
That's the crucial point here. Latin was definitely used. It was the language of the government, the army, the educated folks in the Roman towns.
Makes sense.
But, and this is important, for the vast majority of the ordinary people living across the countryside, they just kept speaking their own native Celtic languages.
So Latin was kind of like a layer on top, but it didn't replace the Celtic foundation for most people.
Exactly. It was primarily the language of the ruling class and administration, not the everyday language of the masses.
Okay, so let's recap. We have the Celts, speaking Celtic languages for over 1,000 years. Then the Romans rule for about 400 years, introducing Latin mainly at the top levels, while Celtic continues underneath.
That's the picture.
So, here comes the puzzle. Because you'd think, with Celtic languages being spoken for so long by the native population, they would have left a massive mark on whatever language came next, right?
Logically, yes. That's what makes this part of the story so, well, surprising. Despite that huge stretch of time, the influence of those Celtic languages on the English language that eventually developed in Britain is remarkably small.
Really? Like, compared to other languages that influenced English later on?
Yeah, think about the impact of Old Norse from the Viking invasions, or Latin through the church and scholarship, or especially French after the Norman conquest. English soaked those up, but Celtic. Very little direct borrowing into the core vocabulary.
Why? What happened? That seems very odd.
The reason seems to lie in the nature of the arrival of those Germanic tribes, the Angles, Saxons, and Jews, who started coming over around 449 CE.
Okay.
It wasn't, by and large, a story of peaceful settlement and mixing. The historical accounts suggest it was much more aggressive.
Aggressive how?
Well, the term used is often conquest, characterized by a policy of subjugation and displacement. The sources talk about driving the native Britons out, killing them, taking their land.
Wow, okay. So not integration, but domination.
Precisely. It wasn't a situation where two populations lived side by side, gradually sharing words and culture. Instead, the Anglo-Saxons seem to have systematically pushed the Celtic-speaking Britons off the best land.
Where did they push them?
Into the more remote, less fertile, often mountainous areas. Think Wales, Cornwall, parts of the north, like Scotland. Or, in many cases, they were simply enslaved.
That would create a massive divide, wouldn't it? Linguistically and culturally.
A huge divide. You have the conquerors speaking their Germanic dialects in the dominant areas, and the subjugated population isolated geographically or socially, speaking their Celtic languages. There just wasn't the kind of daily interaction needed for large-scale language borrowing.
And did that low status for Celtic languages continue?
It absolutely did. Fast forward a few centuries to 1066 in the Norman conquest. The new French-speaking rulers established their own linguistic hierarchy.
Let me guess, French at the top.
French at the very top, Latin important for church and state, English spoken by the conquered Anglo-Saxons, and the Celtic languages. Right at the bottom, utterly marginalized.
So it's a story about power dynamics as much as language itself. The lack of Celtic influence reflects the political and social reality of the conquest.
That's exactly it. The history of the language is completely bound up with the history of power, conflict, and social structure. It's a stark reminder of that connection.
Still, you said the influence was minimal, not zero. So are there any traces left from those ancient Celtic languages?
Yes, there are some footprints, definitely. Just not where you might expect them, like in everyday words.
Okay, so where do we see them?
The most obvious place is in place names. Geographical features, towns, cities, names that were already there before the Anglo-Saxons arrived and often stuck.
Can you give some examples?
Sure. Think about the River Thames. That's a Celtic name. Or major cities like London, York, Leeds, Lincoln. These all have origins that trace back to pre-English Celtic roots.
Huh. I never realized London was a Celtic name.
It seems to be, yes.
Eh.
And you also find composite names where maybe a Celtic element gets combined with an Old English one. Like in some county names, Buckinghamshire, Leicestershire, that Celtic-shire part is Old English, but the first part might have Celtic origins.
So they're the linguistic fossils embedded in the landscape.
That's a great way to put it. They hint at the layers of history beneath our feet.
What about actual words borrowed into English vocabulary? Are there any?
Very, very few that came directly from the Brittonic Celtic, spoken by the native inhabitants during the conquest period. Yeah. It's remarkably sparse.
Any examples at all?
Well, one often mentioned is the word cross.
The Christian symbol.
Exactly. Now, Old English actually had its own word for that. Rood, you still see it in terms like rood screen in old churches.
Okay.
The word cross, interestingly, seems to have entered English a bit later, likely through Irish missionaries.
Irish. So another Celtic language, but not the one spoken by the Britons the Anglo-Saxons were fighting.
That's the fascinating part. It came via Irish monks who were playing a big role in re-Christianizing parts of England after the initial pagan Anglo-Saxon period. So even this rare example wasn't a direct borrowing from the subjugated population during the main settlement phase.
That really underscores how limited the direct linguistic exchange was between the incoming Anglo-Saxons and the native Celts, doesn't it?
It absolutely does. The scarcity of those everyday Celtic words is testament to that social and political barrier, that linguistic exclusion that was part of the conquest. Language was used to assert dominance.
It really makes you think about language not just as a tool for communication, but as a tool of power and identity throughout history.
Definitely. And how those historical power dynamics can leave echoes centuries later.
Okay, so let's bring this part of the journey together. We've seen English today as this global giant, traced its lineage back to the Indo-European family and the Germanic branch.
Right.
And then we went before English to look at Britain's early linguistic landscape, the Celts, there for over a millennium.
Followed by the Romans and their administrative Latin for about 400 years.
And finally, we tackled that big puzzle. Why did the long-established Celtic languages leave such a surprisingly faint mark on English?
Finding the answer in the often brutal nature of the Anglo-Saxon conquest and the resulting displacement and marginalization of Celtic speakers.
Which raises the obvious next question, doesn't it? If English didn't really grow out of the Celtic languages already there, or the Latin the Romans brought, then where did it come from? What were its actual origins on the island?
And that is exactly where we're heading in our next deep dive. We're going to zoom in on that period around the mid-5th century CE.
When the Anglo-Saxons and Jutes arrived.
Precisely. We'll meet those three tribes, explore the Germanic dialects they brought with them from the continent, and see how those dialects mingled and evolved to form the very foundation of Old English.
The ancestor of the language we're speaking right now? I'm looking forward to that.
It's a fascinating story. So next time, it's from three tribes to one language, the Germanic roots of Old English.
Excellent. Can't wait.
And maybe just one final thought to leave you with until then. We've seen today how deeply language history can be tied up with conquest, power, and identity. As English speakers today, using a language with such a complex and dominant history, globally speaking, does that carry any particular responsibilities in how we understand its past or how we view its influence in the world now?
That's definitely something we're thinking about. Food for thought until next time.